Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Doing What Matters, Coping Effectively with Depression. My name is Angela Sullivan, Medical Project Specialist, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. This webinar is being provided as part of the Tourette Health and Education Program, a program of the Tourette Association of America in partnership with the CDC. During the webinar, we would be very happy to hear from you and include your voice in the conversation. You may ask questions or share comments using the question panel on the right side of your GoToWebinar player at any time. We will collect your questions and address them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I would like to mention that funding for this webinar was made possible by our cooperative agreement with the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. The views expressed by speakers and moderators do not necessarily reflect the official policies of the Department of Health and Human Services, nor does the mention of trade names, commercial practices, or organizations imply endorsement by the U.S. government. I want to also mention that the slides for today's presentation are located in the handouts section on the control panel. So before we get started, I wanted to take a few minutes to share some information about the Tourette Association of America. Next slide. At the TAA, we are dedicated to making life better for all people affected by Tourette syndrome and tic disorders through efforts that raise awareness, advance research and understanding, and of course, provide support. Next slide. Awareness, research, and support are the three main pillars of our organization, and through these, we provide our community with many resources. Through social media, public relations, and news placement, as well as our youth ambassadors located across the country, we raise awareness of Tourette syndrome. This is also done through advocacy and lobbying on Capitol Hill for continued funding. But by providing grants and fellowships to both young investigators and other professionals, we can advance research and support clinical trials on Tourette syndrome and new treatment options. The TAA has a network of chapters and support groups located across the country that provide support at the state level for their communities. In addition to this, programs at the TAA, such as online support groups, webinars like the one that you'll hear today, the biennial conference, and in-person presentations, we provide support to our constituents. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Kenneth Phelps. Dr. Phelps is an associate professor of clinical psychiatry and adjunct associate professor of clinical pediatrics at the Prisma Health University of South Carolina Medical Group. Within this context, Dr. Phelps also serves as the director of the Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Outpatient Clinic and co-director of the Tourette Center of South Carolina. Dr. Phelps has special interests in resilience, family systems approaches to treatment, and ACT enhanced behavioral therapy. He has served as a trainee for the Tourette Association of America's Behavioral Therapy Institute since 2016. Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps, and without further ado, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Angela, for your introduction. I'd also like to express my thanks to the Tourette Association of America for inviting me to give this talk. And of course, want to thank all of you that are listening in today. I know many of you are taking time from your busy schedule, your stressful day-to-day lives. And I want to echo what Angela said about any questions you may have or comments you may have to please put those in the pane to the right where you can make comments, because we're going to do our best to get around and answer some of those for folks who have those questions. Before we get started, first want to share some of my professional disclosures. I've been a part, as you heard, of the TAA's Behavioral Therapy Institute for the last few years. This involves teaching and supervising clinicians around the country and also around the world. And so I'm happy to talk about CBIT in the question and answer period, though the focus of this talk is going to be on depression. Secondly, I was also invited recently to give a talk through our prior Southeast Center of Excellence Consortium on resilience through the University of Florida. And lastly, last disclosure is my prior board service for the Children's Trust of South Carolina. And this is an organization whose mission is to prevent abuse, neglect, and unintentional injury across our state. So let's start with our objectives for today. First, I want to define what's meant by clinical depression and recognize the impact of this mood state for people living with tics, but also for their family members. Secondly, I'd like to develop some skills and talk about some ideas that may be helpful to unhook from unhelpful thinking patterns and instead help us engage with meaningful activities that give us purpose and give us direction in our lives. And then finally, I'd like to identify and discuss how our relationships play a key role in overcoming struggles with depression. And my hope is that this talk can help those living with tics, can help caregivers or parents or spouses of people living with tics, and also more broadly, help anyone who may be in the throes of depression. So let's start with just defining what we mean when we say depression. It's important to acknowledge that everyone copes with sadness and with grief and with adjustment difficulties in their lives. But for a subset of the population, they have prolonged times where they feel low, they feel sad, empty, or even hopeless. And this shows up in a lot of different ways. For some people, it may show up as irritability or anger. For others, it may show up as substance abuse, or it may show up as withdrawal from people they care about. And typically, individuals find themselves not enjoying activities that were previously filled with joy. So someone who enjoyed gardening may no longer find it fun or enjoyable to garden, or a favorite TV show may not bring laughter in the same way it previously did. Individuals dealing with depression may lose weight or gain weight, and they may find themselves having their sleep patterns shaken. Emotionally, depression leads us to carry a pretty heavy load of shoulds, a lot of thoughts that are characterized about what we should have done, what we should be doing. And this leads to feelings of guilt, shame, and worthlessness that tend to be key features of this struggle. Understandably, individuals have a hard time focusing and accomplishing necessary tasks because of concentration difficulties. And due to the amalgamation of all of these symptoms, people who live with depression may be more likely to think of death or even make attempts to die by suicide. I'd like to share some personal thoughts on depression that come from a book entitled An Unlikely Strength: Tourette Syndrome and the Search for Happiness in 60 Voices. This is a book written by Larry Barber, and you can find this excerpt on the Tourette Association of America's website. I was lying spread eagle on my living room floor when I returned. It was like a movie scene of traveling through time or returning from a flashback. In fact, that was my first thought. I'm back. My second thought was, from where? But I knew from where. I had returned from an intense episode that had lasted months. And with that, for the first time in my life, at the age of 40, I learned I suffered from depression. And my therapist had been telling me for quite a while that she thought I had clinical depression, but I resisted the diagnosis. There was plenty to be done healing the rifts of my self-image that was caused by Tourette syndrome. I was impatient with her. Let's just get on with the work at hand, I repeated. That's what's causing my suffering. I didn't know about all the comorbid conditions such as depression that can sometimes accompany Tourette syndrome. And in a mysterious way, my depression was invisible to me. It was simply my life as I knew it. I remember sitting opposite a friend and shaking my head sympathetically as he described barely being able to get out of bed in the morning, having no desire for what life offered, feeling a constant and deep-seated despair. And all the while, I was experiencing those same symptoms. I seemed to lose months at a time, suddenly realizing it was April when the last thing I could remember, it felt like January. Spending day after day fighting a near physical pain, as if every cell in my body ached with sorrow. Building a stable reality only to have it suddenly snuffed. Holding my facade of normalcy like an acrobat spinning plates on sticks as I maneuvered through my demanding job as a television writer and producer. How is it that I didn't know I was depressed? This narrative is powerful because depression can sometimes enter like a slow-moving fog that overtakes us in gradual ways. Whereas for others, depression can move like a train that slams us so hard and so fast that we can barely catch our breath from the despair. Mental health and medical professionals, we use a lot of names to describe depression. And in my opinion, I think it's really vital that you find a care team of providers that first sees you as a person, a human being who's suffering and in need of support rather than a diagnostic label. However, I still thought it was important to share this list of conditions where depression is a key feature. So you're aware that there are a lot of different diagnoses where depression is a part of the clinical picture. And my hope is that by having this diagnostic information, individuals can at times better advocate for themselves in what is our disorganized and siloed healthcare system. The primary difference between these disorders you see on your screen is the duration of symptoms and the co-occurrence of other factors. So, for instance, major depressive disorder, or MDD, requires 2 weeks of symptoms, whereas persistent depressive disorder, or dysthymia, requires a more prolonged course of low mood, where an individual may have been low for 1 year if they're a child, or up to 2 years or more for an adult. And in the case of bipolar disorder or cyclothymic disorders, people have times of at least a few days to a week or longer where they're the extreme opposite of depressed. They're hypomanic or manic, but they're also having times where they feel very low. And in other cases, it may be that things like hormonal changes, substances, or medications are responsible for worsened mood. The things I'm going to talk about today, the techniques we're going to spend the remainder of our time going through, are what's called transdiagnostic, meaning that they are effective across a broad range of diagnoses. But let's first take a look at some specific data on depression amongst individuals living with tic disorders. The recent TAA impact survey that was conducted in 2018 has illuminated the importance of this topic, because around 36% of adults and 42% of children describe the hardest part of managing Tourette syndrome as co-occurring conditions. And many of you have probably seen the image of the iceberg. And one of the things under the surface, one of those co-occurring conditions are mood states like depression. Consistently, also, we know researchers have found that those living with Tourette syndrome report higher rates, often double, depending on the research study, of depression or irritability compared with populations who are not living with tics. Of great concern is 51% of adults and 32% of youth report considering suicide or engaging in self-harming behaviors. One important consideration here is that respondents may have included self-harming tics. As we know, individuals can have tics that involve striking their body in their answering of this question. And I'd encourage those of you who'd like to learn more about the topic, the very important topic of suicide and suicide prevention and prevention of harm, to look on the TAA YouTube channel, as there's a wonderful talk from the recent conference by my colleagues, Drs. Coffey, Lewin, and McGuire, though we will briefly touch on this at the end of our presentation. So why are we seeing greater rates of depression amongst individuals living with tics? We know that people who are living with tics often report lower self-esteem, and this is strongly influenced by discrimination from others in the community. Examples include being bullied, being removed from class or extracurricular activities, or being treated unfairly within occupational settings, all things that a large number of adults and children reported in the recent impact survey. Another factor may be difficulty forming friendships or intimate relationships. The quality of a person's life is strongly associated with the quality of our relationships. So when disabling tics or harassment from others serves as a barrier to building connection, that can result in loneliness and dejection. So I know the data I just presented can feel very overwhelming, almost like you're swept up into a horrific storm. It reminds me, I'm from the Outer Banks of North Carolina originally, and we commonly hear threats of hurricanes that were coming ashore, and hearing such hard data and lived experiences can be heartbreaking and can cause us to feel heavy and feel overwhelming. And this is often a feeling that goes along with things like depression. People often, when they're depressed, describe a heightened emotional state where their anxiety runs amok and their physiological signals surge, which can sometimes make tics worse as well. You know, it's sort of like this image you see on your screen of being on an old boat that's being tossed about the ocean. Lightning, thunder, strong winds threatening to destroy the vessel. So I want to start by introducing the first technique that we often use in treatment, which can help us ground ourselves in the midst of an emotional storm. One way we can ground ourselves in the midst of the emotional storm is doing what Dr. Russ Harris calls dropping an anchor or anchoring. And I'd like to just take a moment to practice this with you right now. So you start by, wherever you are, just taking a few slow breaths. Noticing your thoughts and feelings or memories that show up. Pushing your feet hard into the floor, anchoring your feet to whatever surface that you stand or sit. Noticing the tension, sitting forward in your chair as you push your fingertips or hands firmly together, grounding yourself in this moment. Noticing your breath, the temperature, the sensation, as well as your thoughts and feelings and memories that show up. Noticing your body in the chair, your hands, your feet, your back. And looking around and maybe noticing 5 things you can see. And also noticing 3 or 4 things that you can hear. And finally, noticing anything that you may be touching. Your body in the chair, the room around you. And you and I having this talk together as you just re-engage with your breath. Realizing that you've taken this hour out of your day to learn about how to cope with really hard feelings, really difficult things that show up. This step of anchoring or grounding yourself is part of a lot of different therapeutic traditions. But often it's an early strategy that we use in a type of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, is a third wave cognitive behavioral therapy, as you've probably heard people reference CBT, that helps us create different relationships with our internal thoughts, with our feelings, with our memories, or with our sensations. And many of the strategies I'll suggest today come from acceptance, mindfulness, and behavioral traditions, as well as with CBT. So before we move into some additional strategies, I want to share this visual of the cognitive model from CBT. And it visually depicts how our contextual factors, or our situations and thoughts and reactions, can reciprocally influence one another. For instance, if you look at the top, individuals with Tourette syndrome experience a variety of stressful situations. And this might include things like relationship stressors, occupational stressors, or work stressors, educational or financial stressors, or health-related stressors. And in these situations, a lot of automatic thoughts or images show up. These thoughts can sometimes, for all of us, sound like always or never, or like labeling ourselves using derogatory language, or seeing ourselves as isolated forever, or predicting the worst. We sometimes call these automatic thoughts or images ANTS, or ANTS, automatic negative thoughts. The reactions that come from these experiences, these situations, and these difficult negative thoughts we're struggling with often look like many of the symptoms I listed earlier: fatigue, heaviness, sleep disruption, appetite changes, avoidance, not engaging with as many pleasurable activities, sadness, longing, anger, or irritability. And they fall into these three categories you see down at the bottom: emotional, behavioral, and physiological or body reactions. So the next several slides will provide some initial strategies to relate differently to some of these experiences, approaching them openly and with curiosity rather than getting caught up in the perpetual tug of war where we often find ourselves. So let me give you some examples of common thoughts that emerge for us when we're in the midst of a depression. And many of these examples actually come from adapted questions or comments from prior TAA talks that I've given. The first, Billy makes a mistake on his schoolwork due to not reading the directions. And he immediately says, "I'm so stupid." Isabel strikes out in the softball game. And on the way home, she vents, "My team hates me. Why do I even bother?" And lastly, Ashley doesn't get a second call for a job interview, and she thinks, "I just feel like such a disappointment. Things just don't work out for me. They think I'm weird and I'll probably never find a job." If you notice, these thoughts often label the person: "I'm stupid," or "I'm a disappointment." Mind read, "Others hate me," or "thinking this of me," or catastrophize or think the worst: "I'll never find a job." You know, one of the things I really want to highlight before we move on is that we all, to some degree, have a not good enough story in our mind, or some version of the inadequacy story that plays out. But we know that individuals who are living with depression tend to have a louder and more demanding internal critic. We often do this experiential exercise in treatment. If you think of your hands as representing your thoughts, all the thoughts that may go through your mind, particularly some of the thoughts that I may have mentioned a moment ago, what is it like when these thoughts are covering your eyes? When we're so hooked by the thoughts that we have no space to see the world. All we can see and all we can hear are things like, "I'm just failing as a mom," or "I'm stupid," or "I'll never find anyone," or "nothing ever goes right," or "I just can't do anything. My motivation's gone." what happens with depression is the burden of it often blocks us, like the hands in the picture, from seeing our future, seeing who we want to be, seeing possibilities, and seeing what most importantly matters to us. The why that pushes us to do hard things, our values, and who we want to be. One hope in treatment is to observe and notice our thoughts. What this does is it doesn't get rid of the thoughts or make the thoughts go away or disprove them, but it brings our hands down ever so slightly. And this allows us to carry our interfering thoughts while still seeing what matters, to us in the future. And one way to do this is by using what's called unhooking techniques. And these are not techniques to, as I said, get rid of private experiences, but rather to just approach them a little differently. And there are a lot of different ways to unhook from thoughts, and I just wanted to list 2 here for you. The first, and a great place to start, is just noticing and naming when you get hooked. First, you start and just pause and check in with yourself. You notice your body, you notice your thoughts, and you ask yourself the question, am I in my head right now, or am I in my life? Am I in the present moment? Am I focused on what matters to me right now in this moment? Or am I stuck in the I'm not good enough story or movie that keeps playing in my mind? To ask yourself, what would it be like to just notice and name when I'm hooked? I don't know about many of you, but I know for me, sometimes I find myself hooked by negative thoughts, and most people I interact with do, and we don't even realize it, and it's informing our behavior. So sometimes just being aware of that first step can be so powerful. And here's some examples. When we notice and name this, I'm stupid can become, I notice my mind saying I'm stupid. Or I'm a loser can turn to I'm having the thought that I'm a loser, giving us just a little bit of space between us and that thought. And lastly, I'll never find a job may shift to there go my thoughts again, fortune telling and predicting the future. We're not changing or necessarily disputing the thoughts per se, but we're just practicing getting that distance. We're just noticing the mind almost like a thought generating machine, like the thunderstorm for the boat on the sea that keeps sending lightning bolts or wind since you've set sail. And this may allow us to unhook from the thoughts enough and free us up enough to do some of the things that really matter and make moves in the direction in our life that where we want to be. You heard me mention earlier criticism, and one way our mind really typically can get us is by being critical. And many of the clients I see here actually have a name for their inner critic. The critic, the bully, the jerk, the dictator, whatever that internal voice is that often sounds like a hostile coach that's yelling corrections at a player on the sideline. So one way, there's been a lot of writing about this, is to change this self-criticalness is through self-compassion. And to define self-compassion, this means giving ourselves the same kindness and the same care that we give a good friend. And this takes often a good bit of practice because we can often give pretty good advice and be very empathetic and caring to someone else who may be in a very similar situation to our own, but struggle to extend the same degree of compassion and care to one of the most important people in our lives is ourselves, who we have to walk around with every day. So here's the difference. Criticism might say, you should really just get out more. If you don't get your act together, things will never get better. Just don't act like such a failure. Where compassion might say, life can really be challenging sometimes. It can feel overwhelming when you think of everything to do. So maybe you just start with the first step. It may be one step forward and a couple steps back initially. but give yourself credit for even trying, because that's some of the hardest part of this. One of my most favorite exercises that helps people get in touch with our internal voice, whether you're a teenager with Tourette syndrome, a parent or loved one, an adult living with Tourette's, a partner, is to think about a time that you made a mistake, or a time where you really wanted to change something or things just weren't going the way you wanted. You pull out a sheet of paper, or you can open your phone or a computer, and you write a letter to yourself from the voice of the critic. What would the critic say? What would the bully say to you? And then just notice how that feels. And after you do that, pause for a moment, flip the paper over, open a different document, and then write a letter to yourself from the voice of your compassionate self, as if you were giving advice, or as if you were being there for someone else who had made that mistake or had that struggle. The funny thing, reason I wanted to include this is when I've done this, I've noticed that if I write it on a piece of paper, that even my handwriting looks differently depending upon how I'm treating myself in that moment. And interestingly, I just ask you to notice that those two contrasting voices come from the same person. They come from you. We all know that sometimes we can at times propel ourselves into doing better by being perfectionistic and by being critical of ourselves, but that can very often lead people into a space of depression. And one of the antidotes for that is compassion. So my kids ran into the room in part when I was putting this talk together, and they were very excited that Dory made it to the talk. I wouldn't be adequately covering how we address depression and treatment if I didn't discuss this topic of behavioral activation. We know that individuals who are stuck in dark emotional places tend to have thoughts like, it'll be too much effort. It'll turn out badly anyway. I won't enjoy it. The last time I did it, it felt horrible when I did it, or people judged me, or it turned really poorly. So what happens is people gradually stop engaging with activities that were previously pleasurable or previously reinforcing. So without the possibility of reinforcing activities, individuals are more likely to sink deeper and deeper into depression. So this is especially important, in my opinion, for the population living with tics and Tourette syndrome, in that it's so vital to find safe spaces, supportive spaces when possible, where individuals are accepting and open to being around your tics and having conversation about that. Because when those social avenues are shut down and we don't activate ourselves and don't do things like be around others, that can very often be a recipe for depression. So first, one way we help people with behavioral activation is by doing things like keeping track of activities throughout your day. So one way to do this is just keeping a schedule of what you do during the day, or think about what you did today, for instance, and just rate your mood from those activities from 1 to 10. So 10 might be the happiest or best mood you could imagine, and 1 would be the most deeply sad you would feel, and a 5 would be, I'm feeling okay. And then if you do that for a period of time, you could do it for a day or for a couple weeks, you look for trends, or you look for themes, like what makes my mood go up and what makes my mood go down. And this is the first step of behavioral activation, which involves monitoring activities or activity monitoring. The next step is actually scheduling activities. So specifically scheduling activities that have historically brought you pleasure or brought you achievement or mastery or connection with other people. So I'm going to say that again. Purposely putting things in your schedule that in the past, even if they don't in the present, but in the past have brought a sense of joy to your life. Or thinking about like, what are things when I check it off my list or my day that make me feel like I've accomplished something, I've done something. And then lastly, things that involve other people who are supportive, who are caring, who are loving, things we might be able to do with those people. This is called activity scheduling or pleasurable activity scheduling. It's important when we do this to notice and name when we get hooked. Definitely a lot of thoughts are going to come up. That's what depression does. It tells you things like it's not worth it. You know, so you have to say, can I notice that? Can I notice these thoughts? Can I notice this and engage still with the scheduled activities despite them? This is a really challenging endeavor. And much of this talk is used to give you some strategies, but not all that exist out there to deal and cope with depression. And I want to mention another, for some individuals, is medication. And medication, to talk in depth about, is not in my scope of practice, but we know for individuals who are struggling with severe depression can be a very important and useful strategy to have in their toolbox. So in the words of Dory, it's so hard, but to just keep swimming. Even if you get sidetracked, even if you struggle, even if the things on the schedule don't happen, to go back to the slide before, to be self-compassionate even in those moments. What might we advise someone else to do in the midst of struggling to get the next step done? So I mentioned I'm from the Outer Banks, and there's a lot of lighthouses there. And going back to our prior imagery, you know, if you're in the midst of a storm, after you ground yourself in the storm, it's really important to look for the lighthouse. The lighthouse is the values that matter to you. And so when I say values, let me just give you a few examples from the ACT literature. It may be, you know, I want to be authentic. I want to find connection. I value being an advocate for equality and for justice. I want to be persistent and I want to be resilient. I, in recent years, had the pleasure of being a part of the Youth Ambassadors and Rising Leaders program. And one of the things those emerging adults, young adults taught me is that a lot of them had really clear values on who they wanted to be and what they wanted to pursue in this world. And that is a guiding light in moments when you're trying to drop an anchor and your boat is getting tossed and turned in different directions. And I'm currently writing up a study on growth and resilience amongst young adults living with Tourette syndrome with some colleagues of mine at the University of Florida in Miami. And interestingly, when we looked at the data of what people said, the most frequently endorsed areas of growth, these are things people reported that they grew because of their tics or Tourette syndrome, were the following. I developed new interest I wouldn't have developed otherwise. I know better that I can handle difficulties. I know I can handle hard things. And lastly, and to me, one of the most meaningful is I have more compassion for others. So we talked about self-compassion, but going through a really hard thing gives us a degree of compassion and empathy for other people that is so valuable, and we need more of that in the world. So, you know, perhaps the stress and strain of the storm could guide you or those in your life living with Tourette's to a powerful mission once you get ashore. So another way to facilitate behavioral activation or just good mental wellness is to use the accountability and support of a community, which is why I'm part of school of fish up here. You know, a group of people, a people that bring you hope and bring you comfort. Who are those people? Who can help me be an advocate? Who in my life could foster my resilience? And how can, if you're a loved one, how can I be present for the pain of my loved one? How can I listen? How can I validate? How can I hear without jumping straight into problem solving? I think that's, for me, one of the hardest parts of being a parent and also being a therapeutic provider and seeing people in therapy is sometimes we move so quickly into problem solving. A lot of people just want to be seen and heard and valued into where their struggle is first. There's a quote that says, one of the most problematic parts of communication is that when we listen, we're listening to respond rather than listening to understand. And I think a lot of individuals who are struggling with depression first want to be understood and heard before the person listening moves into problem solving or trying to give solutions or responding to what's showing up. So conversely, it's also important to think about who in my life, if I did that schedule and thought about my numbers when I'm a 1 or 2 or 3, you know, who is, when I'm around them, I feel more down. They're maybe critical or judgmental, or, you know, they're someone who are toxic in my life in some way. And to think, can this be repaired? You know, can there be some work done in couples therapy or family therapy or just in conversation or a letter to this person to repair this? Or is this someone I need to work hard to set some firm boundaries with, which is a really challenging task. Sometimes it may be advocacy, it may be educating people on tics or on what kinds of experiences we're having in community settings, to have a more informed and supportive community rather than a judgmental and discriminatory group of people that we're encountering a good bit of the time. So broadly, we're asking ourselves, what can we do together to move in the direction of the lighthouse? And what would it look like to be living a life congruent with the lighthouse? And at the core of this discussion is making room for all types of fish in the ocean. You know, we all want to belong, and this theme of this talk around sea life not only comes from my love of growing up near the beach, but also I have a client who describes himself as a puffer fish that easily reacts, gets rageful or defensive. You know, he's a teenager who lives with tics. And he says, you know, he finds himself blowing up often in response to perceived threats in his environment, perceived threats in the water. And this client also sees other people around as beautiful clownfish that kind of coexist with ease, like life's not as hard for them. And so we've had a lot of discussions about the beauty that exists because of the uniqueness of all inhabitants of the ocean. Similarly, finding the beauty and finding the value of all of us, no matter what kind of person we are walking around. And I wonder what might happen if we treated our families and our communities with the same care. So I mentioned I want to end this talk with some information about safety planning and about resources. So the key components of a safety plan are first identifying some of the key warning signs of something like suicidal thinking, suicidal actions, or self-harm. We sometimes use the acronym IS PATH WARM. The IS, the IS, stands for ideation or having suicidal thoughts, and substance abuse, which is a big risk factor. The PATH stands for purposelessness, feeling like you don't have a purpose or a reason to belong. A for anxiety or agitation. T for feeling trapped. And H for feeling hopeless. And lastly, the warm part is withdrawal from people we love or care about or our communities, anger, recklessness, and mood changes. So these are warning signs that we think about as clinicians, but I would encourage you, if you're coming up with your own safety plan or working to keep yourself safe, to think about what are your personal warning signs for self-harm or suicide, and how can you be aware when you're sliding into that difficult space. Secondly, we often ask people to document coping skills, like what's worked in the past or what maybe could work. Maybe some of the things we've included today, a type of therapy called DBT, or dialectical behavioral therapy, has some really great strategies that come out of distress tolerance or emotional regulation. And CBT actually uses a hope kit. It's one of the most powerful interventions, I think, when an individual is struggling with suicidality or self-harm, which is you have a box or an area of your room where you keep pictures, lyrics from songs, letters, mementos, self-care items like lotion or candles, anything at all that may bring us hope. You know, one of the most powerful things is sometimes I'll have family members write letters to the person who's struggling in this way, and it's a space in their house where if they're feeling self-critical or feeling negative, they can go and just remember to go to this space to try to find hope and try to find some peace. Also, we always want to think about limiting access to methods of harm. This might include medications or knives or guns. We want to include numbers for key friends or family members or supports, people that could be reached out to. And then, of course, there are those professional resources, 911 and emergency departments or behavioral health emergency departments, but also there's a text line 741-741 where you can text, and they will actually text you a link to a variety of different coping skills and ideas that far exceed what we can cover in an hour today. And someone also will begin texting with you and talking you through how you're feeling and trying to help you keep yourself safe or keep your family member safe. And of course, there's the suicide prevention hotline, 1-800-273-TALK. As a reminder, these slides are available in the presentation. If you go over, you can see there's a PDF available. And anyone, certainly you can contact me through the TAA if you have any additional questions about seeking resources or supports. I lastly wanted to include this list of resources. The TAA has a list of providers who do CBIT and have some level of experience with treating tics and working with people who are living with tics. We would consider CBIT sometimes if the depression seems mostly secondary to the distressing tics. If a person came in and told me, I really feel depressed, but part of that is I'm so socially isolated because I can't go out because my tics are so interfering when I go out into community settings. We may lean on those strategies from CBIT that could help the individual at times perhaps manage some of the symptoms that are coming up and allow them to navigate some social settings, ideally a little bit with a little bit more ease. I wanted to include a sister organization of the TAA, the International OCD Foundation. We often use a type of treatment called ERP, exposure therapy, and ACT. If we feel like a big part of the depression might be distressing, obsessional kind of thinking. And the IOCDF has a wonderful YouTube page as well that includes a lot of great live webinars and videos similar to the TAA. The next three organizations, or four actually, are organizations where you can find a behavioral or CBT therapist, or you could locate a marriage and family therapist. And many of them have a find a therapist or find a psychologist page where you can actually search for a mental health provider. And then lastly, I included some bibliotherapy. And what that means are these are resources such as books that you can kind of read on your own that give some strategies to help cope with things like depression, but also can be transdiagnostic, so it can be helpful with anxiety and other types of struggles that may pop up as well. So I want to end by just sharing my references, and if there are any questions or any comments, I certainly want to leave the last bit of time here to talk about that as a group. We'll get through as many of those as we can. Today is actually my wedding anniversary, so we can't go too terribly long, or my wife might be texting me soon to to get home, but I'm certainly happy I could spend part of the day with you all talking about such an important topic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps, for such an excellent presentation. As he mentioned, we are going to begin answering the questions submitted during the presentation. As a reminder, if you still have questions, you can submit them in the questions pane in the control panel. If we are unable to get to everyone's questions, here at the TAA, we do have a full-time information and referral staff who would be happy to answer your questions if you email support@tourette.org or give us a call at 1-888-4-TOURETTE. Okay, so we have a few questions here, and the first question someone asked, I'm going to try and decipher it as best as I can. So if your question wasn't answered properly, just feel free to reach out to us. So if somebody has a bout of depression in their life, does this mean that they could get over it, or will the depression stay with you throughout the rest of your life?
That's a wonderful question. So it's a question about the course of depression, and we know that sometimes depression comes in an episodic manner, meaning that an individual may experience a course of depression that lasts a few months or several months and then remits or improves upon its own. A lot of depression may improve on its own with time, but without treatment, an individual can have a greater likelihood of having a recurrence of those symptoms. So they would be more likely to have additional episodes, in part because of the neurobiology of what might be happening during that depression, and or also not garnering the skills in that moment when they're in the midst of a depressive episode to know how to find ways to kind of walk out of the darkness. We know that some of that may also be what are some of the contextual factors, some of the situational factors going on that are influencing the depression. So certainly a lot of substantial loss experiences. I would be remiss not to mention being forced to be much more isolated, like COVID-19, and not being able to go out because of coronavirus and engage in typical pleasurable activities, or things like all the racial discrimination and turmoil currently happening in our country because of the injustices racially. All those things are going to potentially influence hopelessness and depression. And so we're also thinking of, if some of those things get better, situational factors, an individual may be more likely to see their depression pass. And similarly, if the depression is related a lot to things like tics or tic exacerbations, as the tics improve, we may also see some of the depressive symptoms improve. So we really try to individualize it and personalize how we think about the course of depression, but the research would say that that it can be recurrent and reoccur. But certainly we have a lot of quality treatments that we know can help people, and a couple were mentioned today, like CBT and ACT. But medication and some DBT skills and other things like that can also be helpful for people.
Wonderful. The next question I have is it common to feel worse or more sad after going to therapy or discussing your depression and mental health?
Oh man, that's such a good question. I would say that sometimes when people come in to therapeutic visits and they're talking about really, really hard things they may have been avoiding, things they have a hard time looking at just because they're painful. If therapy involves finding ways to talk about those things, to look at those things, to dialogue about those things, sometimes that can bring really difficult and overwhelming feelings. If that's happening in a therapeutic session, I would often encourage that it may be important to have a little bit more structure in the therapy. So at the beginning of the therapy session, there may be an agenda set of what are the most important things to talk about today. And at the end of the visit, there may be a short amount of time that's used to just process like what it was like to talk about these things, to think about what the person might do for the remainder of that day or the next couple days to be able to cope. But really to kind of troubleshoot, how to like experience those feelings and lean into those difficult feelings and those like worse feelings that might show up, but also feeling like you have a plan and that you're being followed closely enough where you feel like the next time you see your therapist isn't going to be weeks on end. All the randomized controlled trials of therapy are usually on a weekly basis. And so If you're feeling worse after, I would make sure that you're seeing your provider in close enough proximity to the prior visit, ideally. But it's something we can see if it's happening time after time after time in therapy. I would really want you to have a conversation with your therapist, your psychologist, or treatment provider, just because you ideally should see a trending up. Like mood is getting better, you're feeling like you can cope better and live the life you want to live. And so I wouldn't want someone to feel worse after most or all visits, most certainly.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So the next question we have is, can supporting our child's interest or skills, such as music, art, and sports, assist in lessening depression in children with Tourette syndrome?
Oh yeah, man, such a good question. So if you go back to the Dory slide of pleasurable activity scheduling, those things that the person listed are beautiful examples of pleasurable activities. Things like playing the piano, playing the guitar. I mean, one of my children is extremely artistic and talks to me a good bit about how that's like her avenue of expressing herself is by drawing or by painting or by scribbling, on a paper. And sports, whether we're talking, soccer or ballet or cheerleading or football, whatever it is, getting out there and being able to be in a community of people when we can, and getting out that energy and kicking a ball or throwing something, I mean, are wonderful ways to help. We also know there's some literature to support exercise and physical activity as being a huge benefit for many individuals living with depression, and that's a big part of pleasurable activity scheduling. So I would foster that. I kind of think of it like a menu. It's important to provide children with a whole array of options that they could do, and encouraging without sort of insisting. And I realize, being a dad myself, that that's a very nuanced fine line there that can be very challenging as a parent. But to try to support engagement with something, whether it be musicality, artistic things, or athletic endeavors.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have time for a few more questions. So can you give any tips or tricks on how to handle two teens that are struggling even more with each other because of the pandemic on top of their Tourette?
Oh, yeah, I feel like this has
Fully
been a
loaded
lot.
question.
Yeah, this has been a lot of the conversations in my office. I have 3 kids at home, and certainly we've had challenging moments. I think it's important to have family time. And when we think about family time, we often think about everybody in the same room, sort of like having dinner or watching a movie. But I also think it's equally important to think about the importance of like dividing and conquering. I was just talking to a parent earlier about this. Is rather than trying to have what one family I see calls forced family fun, triple F, they've realized, like, over the years, it's probably even better to say, what if one parent takes one teenager over here and does this, and another takes another teen over here. One kid's on technology while the other's, doing something with the parent, just to kind of have some independent time from one another. And I also think just like naming it, to say, like, this is really hard. We're all getting sick of each other. We're all getting tired of one another. Like, let's make a schedule where we have a bit of a game plan for the day. It doesn't have to be anything firm. It can be just sort of vague, but let's have a bit of a daily schedule where we know what's up and what we're doing. And in that schedule, you might be able to incorporate some together time, but also being mindful of some like separate time from one another, because the good old 48-hour rule or 72-hour rule, that we only have a certain threshold for our loved ones in close proximity, that has been violated wholeheartedly in the last few months. So,
Exactly.
I think those are my initial thoughts.
Great. Okay, thank you. So we have 2 more questions. Do you have any experience with transcranial magnetic stimulation for medication-resistant depression and/or anxiety?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's out of my scope of practice, but I will tell you that I mentioned 2 of some of the first-line treatments with depression. We're often thinking about psychotherapy as a first-line depression treatment and anxiety. And we're also thinking of medications, particularly in cases of moderate to severe symptoms. But in those cases where an individual may have treatment refractory symptoms, and that means they've tried a number of medications without success, as well as psychotherapy may not have been as beneficial as we would like, some individuals do look at things like TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, as well as ECT, or electroconvulsive therapy. And I am not as aware about some of the data around the efficacy around that. I do know it's used, and I do know there is some data to support it, but I would hate to misrepresent the data, but I do know that it certainly is an area of continued investigation that people are looking into. And I myself have had a handful of people I've seen, mainly the adults I've seen, who have gotten some benefit in the most severe of cases.
Alrighty. And the last question, would you mind repeating the abbreviation for the warning signs of self-harm and suicide?
Yeah, absolutely. As a reminder, you can grab it off of the slides as well, but it's is path warm. And I actually don't know if I put that on the slide, so let me slow down and repeat it again. Is path warm? It's ideation, meaning suicidal ideation or thoughts. The S is substance abuse. The P is purposelessness, not feeling like you have a purpose. The A is anxiety or agitation. The T is feeling trapped. The H is feeling hopelessness, which we know is one of the biggest warning signs for something like suicidality. The W is withdrawal from people in our lives. The A is anger. The R is recklessness, so being very impulsive. And the M is mood changes. And those are things that we're really looking for when we see a marked change from someone's baseline or how they've been functioning, and we see the things show up. And that comes out of some research about suicide that has been done in the last decade or so.
Alrighty, wonderful. Well, that looks like that's all the questions that we have. So thank you again, Dr. Phelps, for such an excellent presentation. This is all the time that we have for our webinar. Once the webinar is closed, you will receive a survey on the presentation. We would greatly appreciate it if you would please complete that and provide your feedback. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of the webinar. If you haven't done so already, please take a chance to download the handouts section before we close out the webinar. The handout is linked there for you. Additionally, the webinar will be posted on the TAA's YouTube channel for those who were unable to participate today. We encourage you to reach out to us about this webinar or for any other ideas and suggestions you may have. On behalf of the Tourette Association, thank you again for joining us and taking the time to view our presentation. Happy anniversary as well, Dr. Phelps. Have a great afternoon, everybody.